Hello, and welcome to today's video. In this episode, we're diving deep into the powerful ideas of Hannah Arendt's personal responsibility under dictatorship. This is not just any academic essay. We're talking about a work that challenges us to think about our own moral responsibility, even when we're up against oppressive systems that seem to crush individual agency. Before we begin, imagine this. You're living under a regime that controls every aspect of life. Politics, education, culture, even your personal beliefs are dictated by an all-powerful system. In such an environment, the idea of individual responsibility might seem to vanish. But Arendt argues something radical. Even in these extreme circumstances, each of us must answer for our actions. Today, we're going to break down her argument, explore its nuances, and see why it remains so relevant, even more so than ever in our modern world. Setting the stage, Arendt and the moral controversy. Let's start by understanding the context. Arendt wrote Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship in the wake of Nazi Germany and during the infamous trial of Adolf Eichmann. You might remember Eichmann as the banal bureaucrat who carried out horrific orders without much reflection. Critics of her earlier work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, claimed that under such oppressive conditions, no one can truly be held responsible for their actions. They argued that if everyone is forced to act in a certain way, individual judgment becomes meaningless. But here's where Arendt makes her stand. She challenges the comforting notion that under totalitarian rule, our individual responsibility dissolves. Even when a regime seems all-powerful, every single decision we make matters. In her view, the very act of thinking and judging for yourself becomes a moral necessity, even an act of defiance. The fear of judging, why we're afraid to decide. Now let's talk about one of Arendt's key ideas, the fear of judging. You might have heard someone say, "Who am I to judge?" But according to Arendt, that isn't about humility at all. Instead, it's a subtle way of saying that no one is really free to choose. And if that's the case, then no one should be held accountable for anything. In today's society, this mock modesty has become almost a default position. We're often reluctant to criticize others or make moral judgments because we fear that we might be seen as arrogant or hypocritical. But Arendt argues that this reluctance is dangerous. When we refuse to judge, we also refuse to take a stand. We end up blaming everything on vague, abstract forces like historical trends or cultural shifts, instead of facing the hard truth that individual choices have consequences. Imagine if, instead of taking responsibility for your own actions, you simply blamed the system every time something went wrong. You might feel safe, but in doing so, you'd be complicit in maintaining that very system. That's the trap Arendt warns us about. Collective guilt. When everyone is guilty, no one is. Another important theme in Arendt's work is collective guilt. You've probably heard the phrase, "When all are guilty, no one is." It sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? Arendt explains that labeling an entire group, or even an entire society as guilty, can actually work to shield individuals from responsibility. When guilt is diffused across a whole population, it becomes impossible to pinpoint who exactly is to blame. This idea of collective guilt can be seductive. It seems to offer a neat, all-encompassing explanation for how atrocities occur. But in reality, it also provides a convenient excuse for those who actually participated in evil acts. By saying everyone was responsible, we risk letting each person off the hook. Arendt challenges us to reject this slippery slope. Instead of settling for vague, collective labels, we must insist on examining the specific choices made by each individual. The cog in the machine, bureaucracy, and the loss of humanity. Let's move on to another fascinating aspect of Arendt's analysis, the cog theory. Picture a giant machine, with each individual functioning like a small, interchangeable gear. In bureaucracies, especially in totalitarian regimes, people are reduced to these mechanical parts. It's a way to depersonalize and depoliticize actions, making it easier for a system to carry out its orders without moral scrutiny. Arendt is critical of this idea because it suggests that when you're just a cog, you have no personal responsibility. But here's the kicker. Even if you're a cog, you still made the choice to be part of that machine. In a courtroom, for example, an individual is held accountable for their actions regardless of how small or insignificant they might seem. The defense that I was only following orders simply doesn't hold up morally or legally. This brings us to an important point. The transformation from being seen as a mere cog back to being a responsible human being happens when we step into spaces where personal judgment matters. The courtroom, the public sphere, even our own conscience. These are the arenas where we can no longer hide behind the system. Every decision we make has moral weight. One of the more subtle yet critical distinctions Arendt makes is between totalitarianism and traditional dictatorships. In a typical dictatorship, a single ruler or a small group seizes power and suppresses political opposition, but there's often still room for private life and personal judgment. Totalitarian regimes, however, don't stop there. They aim to control every aspect of society: politics, culture, education, and even the way you think. Under a totalitarian regime, every member of society is implicated in the state's crimes. There's no safe haven for individual moral judgment because the regime's reach extends into every corner of life. This total control makes it nearly impossible to maintain an independent perspective. And yet, Arendt shows us that even in these suffocating conditions, there are always a few individuals who resist by refusing to participate. These are the non-participants, people who dare to think for themselves and choose not to be swallowed by the system. Moral collapse. When the usual rules no longer apply, Arendt's work also delves into what happens when normal moral standards collapse. Under the extreme pressures of totalitarian rule, the traditional yardsticks we use to decide what is right and wrong begin to break down. Imagine a situation where everything you once believed about fairness, justice, or decency suddenly seems irrelevant because the state has redefined those concepts. Under Nazi rule, for example, many government officials justified their actions by claiming they were choosing the lesser evil in order to prevent a worse catastrophe. But Arendt argues that this kind of reasoning is deeply flawed. It suggests that moral standards can be reshaped overnight and that any behavior is acceptable as long as it aligns with the new, oppressive order. In such a scenario, the act of thinking independently becomes a radical and even dangerous act, rethinking traditional morality in unprecedented times. Now let's talk about traditional moral frameworks. These frameworks are built on principles like retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation. They work well when dealing with everyday crimes, but Arendt points out that they're woefully inadequate for addressing the kinds of atrocities committed under totalitarian regimes. When the crimes are as massive as those of the Holocaust, the usual justifications for punishment or forgiveness don't hold up. Instead, what is needed is a new way of thinking about moral responsibility, one that goes beyond rigid legal formulas and enters the realm of personal reflection and judgment. Arendt urges us to rely not on pre-established norms, but on our own capacity to think through moral dilemmas in real time. Obedience, superior orders, and acts of state, rejecting the excuses. A recurring defense among those accused of participating in state crimes is to claim that they were simply following orders. This superior orders defense, along with the idea of acts of state, is often used to argue that personal responsibility can be waived in the name of duty or national interest. Arendt rejects these defenses outright. Even when facing overwhelming pressure, the idea that you can absolve yourself of responsibility by blaming a higher authority is, in her view, morally unacceptable. In a situation where every order comes wrapped in the ambiguous language of legality, you still have a moral duty to think for yourself. It's not enough to say, "I was just following orders." You must ask yourself why you chose to obey in the first place. By dismantling these excuses, Arendt reaffirms the idea that moral accountability is intrinsic to our humanity. Each of us must engage in our own process of judgment, regardless of the external pressures we face. The new order, when the command to kill becomes normalized. One of the most chilling parts of Arendt's analysis is her discussion of the new order that totalitarian regimes impose. In Nazi Germany, the regime didn't just use violence as a means to control, it redefined the moral landscape entirely. The command, "Thou shalt kill," was no longer directed solely at enemies or criminals, but extended to innocent people who posed no threat at all. This radical inversion allowed even respectable members of society to participate in atrocities without feeling personal guilt. They traded traditional moral judgments for a system where violence became normalized. Arendt's critique here is scathing. It's not the outliers or the overt monsters who are most dangerous, but the ordinary people who allow themselves to be subsumed by a perverse moral order. Independent judgment, the courage to think for yourself. In a world that increasingly demands conformity, Arendt champions the vital importance of independent judgment. Think about it. What would it take for you to resist a system that tells you exactly how to behave in every situation? For Arendt, the key is that inner dialogue, a constant, often silent conversation with yourself. This ability to reflect, to question, and to decide independently is the only way to resist the dehumanizing pressures of totalitarianism. Arendt isn't saying that you need to be a moral genius or a heroic figure. Instead, she argues that every one of us has the basic capacity and the duty to think for ourselves, even when the consequences of dissent might be severe. That internal dialogue is what separates a free, responsible human being from a mindless cog in a machine. Refusal to support, the ultimate act of resistance. Let's consider the notion of support. In many political contexts, obedience is praised as a civic virtue. However, Arendt turns this idea on its head by showing that what is truly required of citizens is not obedience, but support. In other words, when we participate, even passively, in the workings of an oppressive system, we give it our consent, we lend it legitimacy, and in doing so, we help keep it alive. So what does it mean to refuse to support such a regime? For Arendt, it means consciously choosing not to be complicit. It means withdrawing your moral and political endorsement, even if that withdrawal comes at a personal cost. This act of non-participation isn't about shirking responsibility, it's about affirming it. It's about saying, I cannot in good conscience contribute to this system. This refusal is not a passive act. It's a deliberate, active stand against injustice. Whether it takes the form of vocal protest or quiet personal dissent, it is a powerful form of resistance that can have far-reaching effects, confronting the legacy of totalitarianism in our time. Arendt's reflections were written in the aftermath of some of the darkest chapters in human history, but their relevance hasn't diminished with time. Today, we still grapple with issues like bureaucratic dehumanization, the diffusion of responsibility, and the dangers of collective guilt. Even in democracies where we pride ourselves on freedom and accountability, we can see echoes of the totalitarian mindset. For instance, consider the way large institutions sometimes deflect responsibility by pointing to the system or by blaming broad historical forces. It's a seductive shortcut that allows us to avoid hard questions about our own complicity. Arendt's insistence on personal responsibility challenges us to dig deeper and ask, what choices did I make? Could I have done something differently? In an era of rapid technological change and increasingly complex political systems, the capacity for independent judgment is more critical than ever. Arendt's work reminds us that no matter how advanced our society becomes, the core of moral responsibility will always lie in our individual choices. A call to reclaim our moral agency. Every time we choose to question, to dissent, or even to simply refuse to blindly follow orders, we are asserting our freedom. And that in turn lays the groundwork for a more humane society. Imagine a world where more people took responsibility for their actions, where each individual engaged in that quiet, constant dialogue with themselves. In such a world, even the most oppressive regimes would find it harder to justify their actions. Personal responsibility, as Arendt shows us, is the ultimate form of resistance. It's the one thing that no totalitarian system can ever truly control. So as you go about your day, ask yourself, what choices am I making? Am I supporting a system I believe in, or am I choosing to stand by my own moral judgment? Thank you for watching. If you found today's exploration of Arendt's ideas thought-provoking, please give this video a like, share it with friends, and subscribe for more deep dives into philosophy and political thought. And if you have any thoughts or questions about personal responsibility or any of the topics we've discussed today, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Stay curious, stay critical, and most importantly, stay responsible.